one domain of knowledge that would be particularly important, and has been traditionally important for Yupik elders to pass down to the younger generations is Yupik ecological knowledge. Um, and when we talk about Yupik knowledge of landscapes, it is extensive, and it's part of what has enabled Yupik people, as we were talking about before, to survive within an environment that is one of the less hospitable environments for human life. Human life, and from the perspective of, and there's many different perspectives by which to look at human origins, but from the perspective of physical anthropology, originated really in Eastern Africa. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that the environment of Eastern Africa and the environment of the Yukon Delta are not very similar from each other. So humans have spread all across the globe and are now occupying all sorts of different habitats. And for a being that is not, we're not cockroaches or something, we have kind of a lot of fragilities, and yet we're able to occupy all these different landscapes in part because our cultures have developed very sophisticated ways of adapting to different landscapes. Part of the way that we do that is through what's called traditional ecological knowledge, is a term that we use. Traditional ecological knowledge means the knowledge that a group of people accumulates over extensive time periods spent in a landscape. With indigenous groups in particular, we sometimes call that indigenous knowledge, and acknowledge the fact that it is rooted in a specific relationship with a place, and specifically very often rooted in the idea of a relationship with the creator or creators, and sort of a divine relationship with the landscape. But whether or not there's that dimension to it, we emphasize that indigenous groups that have lived in areas for generations upon generations have TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. They understand things about the landscape, about what the animals are doing, about what the plants are doing, about how the ecosystem works, and they don't necessarily need a biologist to tell them that. That doesn't mean that there's not things that a biological scientist can't point out that maybe people weren't aware of, but it's to suggest that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge already stored in the culture. And indeed, TEK as kind of a field of study started in part because, and became popular in part because, scientists that were working for the governments and universities realized that in some natural landscapes that they weren't very familiar with, there were indigenous people living that had lived there for centuries and had tremendous amounts of knowledge that could be of huge benefit to people that are trying to, let's say, manage the harvest of caribou or make sure that the plant species are behaving the way they're supposed to. So a good example of that, actually, and one that I want to make reference to now and bring it back to the Yupik, Anne Fiona Riordan, who's a Anchorage-based anthropologist who's worked extensively with the Yupik groups, she did a study along with some biologists and published her findings in 1999. It's a really good one. It's Yakugat Kayun Pilotat, What the Birds Do, Yupik Eskimo Understanding of Geese and Those Who Study Them. And she talks about the fact that the Yupik elders that she interviewed and Yupik individuals that she interviewed had a tremendous amount of very specific knowledge about geese that they were sharing with biologists like Fish and Game and different groups that were moving, especially university biologists actually, that were moving into the area. People understood and distinguished, of course, between different species of geese, such as brant or different other kinds of geese, but also how the geese chose nests, and the idea that, like, well, when there's fall flooding, the geese observe that there's fall flooding and choose to nest other places. Extensive knowledge about where, for example, brants, this bird that you see pictured here, choose to nest, specifically that they would nest close to the water, but not too close, but kind of in the muddier part, not close to rivers, but rather more close to coastal areas, and kind of, but not like into where the grass gets too thick. Also extensive knowledge about what they ate, and specifically the knowledge that goose species in the area eat a tremendous amount of carex and Puccinellia grasses, which are only about 2% of the plants in the area, but form, as far as biologists can tell, about half of what those birds eat. And that's attested to. Yupik people didn't need biologists to tell them that. That's attested to in the fact that they refer to these grasses, these specific grasses that are found only in small percentages, they refer to them as goose food. So they've observed clearly that this is what geese tend to make the most use of for their food. They had observed population declines over the past century. They'd also observed population life cycles. So they would bring up, like, well, the goose meat doesn't taste as good in the fall because that's when the geese are starting to fly and migrate. And so they're essentially getting more exercise, so the meat is leaner. Or, this is the different ways in which they act when it comes to nesting. And if we take different amounts of eggs, here's how they act towards the eggs, because this is a practical form of knowledge. It's a practical form of knowledge because brant and other types of geese are hunted, and they are also, the eggs were traditionally taken. And so there was rules about that, and also extensive knowledge about that. There was also rules about sort of not only hunting things you needed, not hunting animals that were in places that were hard to reach, so you're not like wasting prey if you can't get to them. So there's rules, and then there's also knowledge that help them adapt, use the resource, and hopefully sustainably use the resource. So there's this just really extensive knowledge, even knowledge of like floods that had happened, 70 years previously, 60 years previously. So knowledge had been passed down clearly between generations. And there was also a great amount of just tacit knowledge, by which when we talk about tacit knowledge, it's the kind of stuff you pick up if you're a fisher, out fishing on a boat for hours on end with a knowledgeable fisher, just kind of the stuff you have to pick up by doing it. So that's, extensive Yupik ecological knowledge. At the same time as Fiona Bjorden talks about, there were some sort of fundamentally different views of human, non-human relations going on in this study between the Yupik people and the university biologists that were working in the area to sort of understand the wildlife populations. As she talks about, and this actually came up in a couple of your readings by Yupik authors as well, but there's the idea, and this comes up in, like I said, some of the other readings that you did by Yupik authors, this idea that animals go to other worlds when they die. This was a traditional belief among Yupik people, that animals go to other worlds when they die and then experience rebirth into this world, whether that be upper or lower worlds. And then also the idea that geese and other kinds of animals that are hunted make a decision to return to the villages, to the areas where they were hunted. And in that regard, it's what we would call relational ecology. And what I mean by that is it's a way of understanding a habitat, a landscape, that puts an emphasis on the sort of emotional and social relationship between animals and people. So, for example, they viewed the decline, the people that Fiona Bjorden interviewed viewed the decline in geese numbers not to overhunting, but instead to lack of hunting, and the idea that fish and game people had overly limited their hunting, and that it was kind of almost an insult to the geese populations, that hunting was not this act of so much predation as it is an act of reciprocity, where people do take animal life and then it feeds them, and then they are respectful towards the dead animal, and then the animal reincarnates or is reborn. And so the fact that that relationship had sort of been disrupted was causing problems in the geese populations. And also just the fact that sort of non-native people were coming into the area, such as biologists, and like kind of having an overly nuisance presence towards the geese. So it was that's a very, very different way of understanding, right? The wildlife biologists would have said, well, if the geese are declining, it's because of overhunting, presumably, or maybe climate change impacts. So two very different ways of understanding what was going on with the geese. But the Yupik elders were expressing it in terms of a relational ecology, and also an ecology where there's what we would call non-human persons. What I mean by non-human persons is the idea, found within many cultures, including many indigenous American cultures, including Yupik culture, that non-human entities can possess sentience and social relationships comparable to, or in some ways similar to, humans, even if not exactly the same. And you see that come out in some of the quotes, a couple of quotes that I'm going to share from that study that I was just mentioning. So, for example, this is from Teresa Moses, a Yupik woman from Tuksuk Bay, and she says, "I used to hear lots of stories about the animals who wore clothing just like people. There was a story about a girl who wore Canadian goose feather parka. When spring came, the woman would be out late. She would be smeared all over the face with mud from eating grasses. One day when it was melting out, she disappeared. She flew away with the geese." And so there's this idea about sort of a goose that sort of has the ability to act as a human and look as a human. And actually, this is found in a lot of different native groups, such as the Kwakwa in British Columbia. The idea of animals as sort of human or human-like beings who kind of then can put on clothes or a covering that makes them into the animals as we observe them. And so that's a very interesting concept. I'll share another one. This is from Charles Friday in Hooper Bay. The geese brought him a boy with them. When it was time, the grandfather of the boy did a kanekun, shamanistic rite involving an incantation and taught the boy how to fly. When the boy learned to fly, he migrated with the geese, and then here's the kicker, they were like people across on the other side. So the idea that entities like geese have their own sort of villages, so to speak, in which they live similar to or like humans, so that in significant ways there's sort of a fluidity between the idea of human and animal. Not to say that there's a confusion. A fluidity is not a confusion. It's not that humans are animals or animals are humans. It's to suggest that animals are people, even though they're not human people. This is found also to some degree in Navajo culture, where I do a lot of my research, where people will talk about they'll talk, when they want to talk specifically about humans, about Homo sapiens, sometimes they'll say five-fingered people and then refer to other types of animals as, for example, bird people or insect people. All right. So now I want to pause there.